Welcome to Biotech Showcase, and welcome to the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine's State of the Industry Briefing. This is our annual event. My name is Tim Hunt. I'm the CEO here at ARM. It's great to kick the year off this way every year, to see a lot of familiar faces and old friends, and also to meet some new folks. Before we start, I do want to thank our sponsor, Form Bio, Kent and the team for sponsoring this important event. My thanks to them. A year ago when we were all here, people may remember a year ago, it was like monsooning rain, right? Like sideways rain. I was struggling with Steven, our head of our communications shop, to get an Uber, right? The Uber guy blew me off, and I'm like, I got to get to my first State of the Industry meeting, and I can't be late. I got to it's an 8 o'clock start. And people may remember I said, it's kind of like the volatility and the storminess, required a bit of persistence to kind of get here. And I kind of alluded to, well, that was kind of like the capital markets were kind of volatile and stormy in 2022. And I thought, get up here in January 2024, maybe things will be a little better. Well, it turns out 2023 was just as volatile and stormy, as you all know. I won't spend a lot of time berating and bemoaning the capital markets. We know they're not where we have wanted them to be. We're all hopeful that things will get better. But I am going to bring a dose of optimism about the field and the amazing progress that we've seen. I'll share some data. And, God created optimists to weather the bumpy times. And that's what I think every now and then we all need. So with that, let me get to the agenda. So we've got a great agenda today. I'll say a few words. And then I'll turn it over to Dr. Peter Marks, the head of CBER, who needs no introduction. He'll talk about expediting the development of cell and gene therapy. And then I'm really delighted. We've got an outstanding panel that came together. It was 1 month ago today that the FDA approved the Bluebird gene therapy regimen and the CRISPR Vertex gene editing regimen, the first gene editing regimen approved in the United States, a seminal moment in the history of biotechnology, I would argue. We'll talk more about that, but we've got a great panel to talk about that, led by Bola Amusu as a moderator, who's the partner and chief scientific officer at Chardin and known to many in this room, Sam Kulkarni, the chairman and CEO of CRISPR Therapeutics, and Andrew Obenshain, the CEO at Bluebird. So I think that's a really special opportunity for us to hear from those folks after Peter gives his remarks, which I know we're looking to both of those sessions. So just a word on the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine. I think many of you are familiar with ARM, but we're a nonprofit international advocacy organization comprised of over 400 members. We are made up of small private biotechnology companies, mid-sized companies to large global pharmaceutical firms. We've got a couple of dozen patient organizations in our membership, about as many academic medical centers, and then the backbone of the industry are a lot of the service providers, the tool providers that really make sure that we can all get our work done. Our focus is really convening the sector, events like this, advancing the field through data and analytics, engaging with our key stakeholders, enabling the development of these very special advanced therapies, and oftentimes trying to drag kicking and screaming into the 21st century healthcare systems to embrace these important new modalities. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. I'll touch on most of these topics today. Okay. We all sometimes hear headlines. I said vol a year. It's good to be honest and transparent. We hit bumps. This has been a long, long journey for many decades in cell and gene therapy. We've hit some bumps in the road. You hear these as well. Gene therapies can be expensive. The capital markets have not been where we wanted them to be. The model sometimes gets questioned and challenged. We see bumps in the road every now and then on safety issues. Peter will talk about the CAR-T matter, and on, right? So we all know that that's part of the challenges. But in reality, this is part of the path. The field is just maturing. I'll talk more about this in a little bit, but it's achieving really what we think of as a new normal. 3 components of my talk today. Breakthroughs are becoming the norm, which is great news for our patients. These products unlock enormous value for both patients and society. And I'll give a couple of examples of how I think the US healthcare system is modernizing really well, led by one undertaking within CMS and some work that Peter and his team are doing at the FDA that I think is incredibly important. So breakthroughs are becoming the new norm. So a year ago, when I got up here, we said, you know, if you think about the arc of gene therapy, the first kind of concept that could gene therapy work to treat human genetic disorders was articulated in the early 1970s, around 1972. That was a 45-year journey to get to Spark's approval of Luxturna in 2017. 45 years, 0 products approved, right? A long, arduous journey. You talk to the academic pioneers that were there when it was a cold winter, right, in gene therapy. I mean, it was a long, hard slog for 45 years. And the kind of 20 leading up to 2017 were brutally difficult. And then we saw this great innovation, 5 products approved within 5 years, right? 2017 to 2022. And last year we said, you know, if we get, with a little bit of luck, we might hit 5 gene therapies for rare disorders within 1 year. And we called it our 5 by 5 by 5. And we get some stuff wrong at the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, but we got that one right, which was great. And great news for patients, especially ones suffering from dystrophic epidermolysis bullosa, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, hemophilia A, and sickle cell disease, right? So 5 very important programs approved in 1 year, a great burst of innovation, and I think a glimpse of a lot of the progress we'll see in the future. And these, of course, were programs approved by Vertex and CRISPR, Sarepta, Celltrans got a cell therapy approved for type 1 diabetes, Bluebird, Gameta Cell, their cell therapy for patients undergoing stem cell transplants for blood cancers, BioMarin for hemophilia A, the Crystal program for DEB, and so 7 in total in the US, great, and 1 program approved in Europe, the Unicure and CSL bearing drug Hemgenix for hemophilia B, an important advance for patients in Europe. You know, we'd love to see more approvals in Europe. I think there's data that suggests that's coming this year, but in total, 8 programs approved of import. Okay, now panning back a little bit, when you look at what do we see across the entire sector, this is what we put out, like sort of an interim sneak preview of 2023 and how things look. We will finalize our report, I believe it's in February, where we'll make sure everything's ticked and tied and we'll do pencils down. But this is our sneak preview, just especially for those here at JP Morgan. So we're looking at, in the order of developers, over 2,500, clinical trials almost 1,900, and investments almost $12 billion this year. It's down slightly year over year. But a lot of talent, time, and money being committed to the field of cell and gene therapy to help patients for whom, as I often like to say, the status quo too often, unfortunately, represents death or serious disability, right? These are debilitating diseases, and we'll talk more about that. So a lot of investment, a lot of progress, and we like to think that our foundation is quite strong. Drilling down a little bit more into 2024, we see a total of 17 programs that in theory could get approved this year. Now, we're not going to get all 17, let's be clear. We'll get a subset of that. But there are 17 things that we can identify at this point that are at least in the discussion. So decisions pending between the US and Europe, 7 total. Submissions pending, 5 total, 3 in the US, 2 in Europe. Possible submissions, 3 in the US, 2 in Europe, for a total of 5. So you put all that together, 11 in the US, a total of 17 across the board, 6 in Europe. And you know, we'll see, but we're optimistic that we'll see a lot of these get pulled through to the finish line. It is also possible that we could see 5 more gene therapies approved in the United States for rare genetic conditions. So we're saying it's possible we could see 2 in 10, so 5 last year and 5 this year. We'll see where we are 12 months from now, but we got a track record at least of having gotten that right once. Drilling in a little deeper, a few firsts and other notable milestones. We expect to see the first ever approval of an adoptive cell therapy for solid tumors in the US, and the first US approval of an allogeneic T-cell therapy, and additional treatments approved for hemophilia A, hemophilia B, and DEB. Again, I think that's the sign of a increasingly maturing field, right, where you see more competition, which ultimately is good news for patients. And if you go back in time to 2019, when the FDA, many remember, the FDA said, geez, we could see 10 to upwards of 20 approvals a year starting in 2025. We think that is tracking rather nicely for that time period. It's conceivable we could see that in the US in 2024, but we'd have to almost essentially run the tables. But a lot of great progress in the field. Okay, with success comes further challenges, and I know a lot of us have heard these in the past, so let me know if this sounds at all familiar. The most expensive drug sold in the United States. Oops, there we go. Most expensive drug sold in the United States. One patient advocate said she was appalled by the price. The price threatens to put this promising treatment out of reach for many patients, even those that are very well insured. Policymakers react to drug prices, calling them exorbitant, akin to ransom. Always helpful rhetoric from our friends in Washington, D.C. But this is not about gene therapy. This took place in 1991 and 1992. These were criticisms leveled at our colleagues at Genzyme, now Sanofi. The drug was Ceridase for Gaucher, was going to keep Gaucher's disease patients alive. Certain death kept alive. And the price at the time was an outrageous, and many would say obscene, $300,000 a year. The system was used to paying for small molecules and some of the most earliest biologics that were a few $1,000s, and $300,000 came along and it blew everybody's mind, right? And the point is that was the early days of the biotech revolution in many ways. Maybe it was the second wave of biotech, the biotech revolution in the early 1990s. But that spurred on, not just Genzyme, but the Biogens, the Amgens, the Genentechs, to say, I can get my head that they're around the business of these ultra-orphan disorders if I can get what they thought was reasonable pricing and work with payers to, over some years, work these things through the system. And I would argue that's where essentially we are today. We're still at the early days of working through the business model. And the good news is healthcare systems have worked through this before. They're adapting right now, I would argue led by probably the commercial payers. And we will work through these challenges yet again. And for those who haven't read it, it's worth a healthy dose of perspective. Pick up Jim Garrity's book on Inside the Orphan Drug Revolution. It'll make you feel better about where we are today, because it's a lot of the long, hard slog of the biotech fight for many decades. Well, one of the things we're going to be talking more about at the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine this year and next year is value and society, and how do we think about these important therapies. And we've got a new framework called Gene Therapy for Patients and Societies, or GPS framework, and it's got 5 components. And it's primarily, for today, I'm going to talk about gene therapies. We'll be expanding that more to fold in cell therapies as well, because it's very similar. But when you really think about the value these things create, right? Let's go through the different components. 1, these gene therapies are targeting devastating, frequently deadly diseases. 2, these are incredibly expensive diseases, most of them. Not all, but most of them are incredibly expensive. 3, these gene therapies are highly effective, and they get approved at a very high rate compared to other modalities. 4, they often save the healthcare system money. And 5, I would argue they are affordable even before taking into cost offsets. Therefore, the healthcare systems out there should find them readily digestible in the years ahead. And I'll drill into that a little bit more as well. So 5 components. First, these are devastating, often deadly diseases. The average life expectancy for the patients, that have available to them today, the gene therapies in the United States, is 40 years. 40 years. That's about half the normal life expectancy of a person, right? Sickle cell disease, somewhere around 40 to 45 on the low end, 55 on the higher end. CALD, 10 years. Duchenne muscular dystrophy, 22 years, right? Devastating, frequently deadly diseases. We are not talking about work that's going to modulate someone's blood pressure, or work on their moderate arthritis. These are devastating diseases. They're incredibly expensive diseases, right? The lifetime cost, the standard of care for most rare diseases is in the millions of dollars. Patients with severe hemophilia A, right, $21 million in lifetime costs. Severe sickle cell patients, $4 to $6 million in costs. Patients with transfusion-dependent thalassemia, over $5 million in costs, right? Very, very expensive disorders that we're targeting. And these are highly effective therapies, right? There's a study, a project that we did with the folks at the Tufts Newdiggs Institute, Mark Trusheim and his shop. And this is something one of our board members, Faraz Ali, who some of you know, who's been involved in orphan diseases for many, many years, said, I just feel like we look at gene therapy definitely, but probably even cell therapy, like our odds of getting approved are very high once we get into the clinic, and we should probably explore that more. And so with our chairman, Devin Smith, and Faraz, we dug into that more and did a little project, and lo and behold, guess what we found? The Tufts guys came back, and they're like, yeah, he's right. They're anywhere from 2 to 3.5 times more likely to be approved once entering phase 1 clinical trials than your average small molecule or biologic. And we've got good benchmarking data from Bio and from IQVIA to compare it to. When you look at orphan gene therapies, they're 3.5 times more likely to get approved. That's a 48% higher success rate in phase 1 trials, 65% higher in phase 2, 30% higher in phase 3. We rolled this data out at our meeting on the Mesa in October. If you have not seen this paper, go onto our website, go onto the Tufts website. And if you're in business development in a large pharmaceutical company and you're in or thinking about getting into gene therapy, read the paper and send it to senior management and tell them the batting average is a lot higher, because it is. It's a good reason to get excited about the field. 4, gene therapies often save the healthcare system money. Now, our good friends and colleagues at ICER, the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, have done terrific work in this area. They've worked with companies. They've dug into the data and done some real spelunking, I would argue, and partnering with all of us, and come back and said, look, at some level, these are a screamingly pretty good deal. Sickle cell therapies, a little over $2 million. Good value for society, never mind for patients. Hemophilia B, somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 million. Thalassemia, somewhere in the neighborhood of $2 million. So a lot of, this is one data point, but I think a lot of the commercial payers are there as well, and through a lot of the efforts of people in this room are getting there more rapidly. And sure, there's work to be done with others, but we're making good progress. So oftentimes saving the system money. And I would argue, and I know this can be a little controversial, I know there's sticker shock when you price a product at $2 to $3 million. I understand, it's natural. But if you look at the data, take the emotions set aside, look at the data, it tells a very, I would argue, compelling story, right? That these products are ultimately digestible by healthcare systems even before taking into account cost offsets. Our colleagues, again, at Tufts Newdiggs have done work on this for many years. Their modeling shows by the year 2030, right, the revenue from gene therapy should be in the neighborhood of $7.5 billion. Now that aligns very nicely with the Wall Street consensus data that's out there. And what does that figure represent in the United States? Well, it's about 0.1% of total healthcare spending in 2030. It's 1.3% of all prescription drug spending in the United States in 2030. Again, not next year, not in 2026, in 2030. So that should be ample time for healthcare systems to adjust to 0.1% or 1.3% of prescription drug spending. It's comparable to what Medicare spent on one diabetes drug in 2022. It's about 1.8% of the economic burden for rare disease in the US, according to the Every Life Foundation. And just for comparison, there are a lot of very expensive medical innovations that people have been using for many years. A heart transplant's about $1.6 million, and there are about 3,500 of them in the United States. An allogeneic bone marrow transplant's over $1 million, almost 10,000 a year. It's a lot of bone marrow transplants. We're going to do some work with, I believe, with Tufts to dig into also very premature babies, which when they're in the NICU and run up months in the NICU are extremely expensive. So more to come, but the fact of the matter is we believe that these gene therapies are clearly affordable. Okay, healthcare systems are modernizing, more good news. CMS, their Innovation Center, CMMI, has, as many know probably, have a cell and gene therapy access model that they are working on right now. We think this is a great development. Devil is always in the details on how things work out, but we've talked to them extensively and are bullish on where they're headed. This would be a voluntary partnership among CMS, state Medicaid agencies, and biotech companies to set up and administer outcomes-based agreements, value-based agreements. We really believe this will be beneficial, especially to smaller Medicaid agencies that will just frankly struggle to put together the infrastructure to measure and really partner with companies. They just don't have the resources. They don't have the resources, they don't have the expertise. So we think they will probably throw some of this over the wall to CMS and let them pick it up and work with them and us on this. This was originally proposed to be rolled out in 2026, and I would argue probably by getting good feedback that we have bigger markets with hemophilia and sickle cell disease coming very rapidly. They pulled it up to 2025, which I think is a good development, and we welcome this effort within CMMI. Okay, now we have Peter Marks here today. I'm going to say some nice things about the FDA. I think many people that know me know I say it when Peter's around and when he's not around. Others can feel free to disagree, but I'm entitled to have a view too. So, look, I think there's just been a great undertaking by Peter and his team to really look at the future of cell and gene therapy and say we've got to organize ourselves differently. There was a restructuring that they did to establish the new Office of Therapeutics Products, which was, I think, a very welcome move. They created a super office out of OTP now. Peter, they announced in August, had hired Nicole Verdun to lead OTP, which we think was an outstanding move. She's now 5 months into her tenure as the new director. People probably missed this over the holidays, right before, I think it was New Year's. Rachel Anatol was hired as the deputy director. She has both deep FDA experience and most recently some industry experience. We think that's a very important hire and will help share the workload, which is significant within OTP. They've been doing a lot of hiring, had a lot of turnover, been doing a lot of hiring. A lot of us hire a lot of people out of the FDA, and that creates a hole that then has to be filled. So I know they're very focused on that. And look, with accelerated approval, you walk around Washington, D.C. for about 5 minutes, and you'll hear lots of screams about abuses of the past with accelerated approval and how it's not fit for purpose anymore, and on and on and on. I give the FDA, Peter and the FDA, a lot of credit for leaning and saying, look, this is a critical tool that we need in the rare disease space. And then Operation Warp Speed has kicked off their new START pilot program for early communication with companies. All important moves. And we are doing a lot to partner with the FDA over the last, call it, year and a half. We're doing to try to accelerate cell and gene therapy development and manufacturing. We spent a day together back on November 1st looking at case studies, what we called the building blocks of platform technologies. How do we accelerate things like AAV, lipid nanoparticles, iPSCs, right? How do you just move things along a lot faster? It was a big effort with a number of experts and companies, with a big team from Peter and Nicole and their team at the FDA and some outside consultants to look at how we can continue to mature and scale in that area. That people probably missed, but there was some draft guidance that got put out right at the very end of the year on a very thorny issue for the field related to CMC potency assays. we did a similar full-day workshop in October of 2022 with the FDA. It was a full-day undertaking with some academic leaders, I think about 15 leaders in the industry, and we really went deep and worked hard on this topic. We later produced a white paper, and now we have some updated guidance that on quick review looks really great. This is an area that can be time-consuming. As people know, it can be very expensive, so trying to modernize this piece within CMC we think is important. We spent a lot of time with Peter in November. I mentioned the November 1st meeting when we got together to talk about platform technologies. We held a meeting of about 20 leaders in the industry. Peter was gracious enough to come for the day, and that included many of the leading patient organizations, 2 sickle cell patients, I'll come back to that in a moment, a number of bioethicists, government officials, and prominent academics, and we really spent time talking about the interface of gene therapy and society and access and things like ethics. And I know what you're thinking, this guy must be a kook. He's talking about ethics. Well, doesn't he know we're at the JP Morgan Healthcare Conference? This is about financing, not about ethics. But I would argue ethics is a very important component of the work we all do, and we're going to be talking about that more and more this year, and I want to, again, commend Peter for committing the time to it. And then we've been doing some work to try to help the horizon scanning. What's coming up on the horizon that the FDA should be aware of, and we'll talk more about that this year. Okay, I'm going to move on to sickle cell disease. I'm then going to turn it over to Peter, who'll get up and give his remarks in a couple of slides. So again, a month ago we saw these dual approvals, which was, we're calling it the biggest day in the history of gene therapy. Others can have their view. We think we're certainly in that discussion. A very important gene therapy from Bluebird, the first CRISPR-based therapy from CRISPR Therapeutics and Vertex in the United States, a long overlooked patient population and the largest patient population to date. And it'll test the system. There are 10 to 20,000 patients out there that could be eligible for this regime. Many of them are in Medicaid programs. That's all interesting and helpful data points, but our North Star is what matters the most. And we were very pleased when we had that forum that I mentioned of about 20 people on November 16th to have 2 very special people join us. Victoria Gray, who was the first patient to be dosed in the CRISPR trial, and Tasha Samuels, who is a Bluebird patient, a gene therapy patient. To listen to their stories was so incredibly moving. I don't think there was a dry eye in the house. To hear them talk about their pain crises, how they had trouble focusing, staying employed, being moms, holding a job, being a good member of a family and their community, it was just absolutely heartbreaking. And one of them said, I just didn't want life to go on. Like it was that bad. And then remarkably, through their families, through their faith, through their friends, they hung in there and eventually got into these 2 very important trials, and today feel amazing. I mean, it's a great story. And so I'm going to break from typical tradition, and I do want to take a moment just for us to recognize Andrew and the team at Bluebird, Sam and the team at CRISPR, and the Vertex thing for their perseverance over many, many years, and finally getting these 2 important therapies to the finish line. All right, with that, I am going to turn it over to Peter. Thank you.